Bombing of Hiroshima. After almost 6 years of uninterrupted fighting and being completely surrounded in the east and the west by the Allied armies, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, and the Third Reich finally surrendered on May 7, 1945. However, there was no time for rejoicing, as the unrelenting Japanese forces kept fighting till the last man. As the Imperial Japanese Army was unwilling to surrender, the American command was confronted with two options. One was invading the Japanese mainland with the army and marines, which would lead to more bloodshed on both sides. The second was deploying an unprecedented weapon of mass destruction, the atomic bomb. U.S. forces firmly believed that this action would lead to the immediate surrender of Japan and serve as a deterrent to Stalin and the Soviets, but it would ultimately take 2 atomic bombs over the 2 most Catholic Japanese cities to force the empire into submission. The crew of B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped the first bomb over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and the effects of the warhead were devastating. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, detonated with the force of over 15,000 tons of TNT. There were over 80,000 casualties, and it destroyed over 5 square miles of the city. Another 70,000 survivors would eventually perish in the following years due to radiation exposure. The once vibrant and beautiful downtown shopping district, where hundreds of merchants sold their goods, was reduced to rubble and scattered utility poles. In addition, the street of temples close to Teramachi, a place of worship and family gatherings, was completely destroyed, and all the humble wooden houses that stood along the bank of the Aragawa River suffered the same fate. Meanwhile, the Hiroshima Station, another of the city's icons, was the only structure left standing, and the product exhibition hall near the Motoyo-Sagawa River, regarded as the detonation's ground zero, was severely damaged and is known today as the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. The city eventually came back from the tragedy and regained its population, while some of the lost architecture has been partially restored. Bombing of Nagasaki. 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, the plutonium bomb known as Fat Man was dropped over the skies of Nagasaki. The 22-kiloton blast wiped out 30% of the city. Over 80,000 Japanese perished from direct exposure, while tens of thousands succumbed to the radiation effects during the following years. Everything within a mile of Ground Zero, the Mitsubishi factories near the port, was reduced to ashes, and 14,000 homes were lost within seconds. The harbor was decimated, except for a Christian Methodist church that stood blocks away from it. Nagasaki was rebuilt after the war thanks to the Culture City Reconstruction Law, and ancient Japanese and Christian temples were restored. New streets were also traced because of the rapidly growing car industry and the fishing and shipbuilding industries. Several monuments stand today to remember the hecatomb of the bomb, such as the Ground Zero monuments where the detonation happened, as well as the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum. Bombing of Dresden. During the final days of World War II, American and British bombers heavily pummeled the city of Dresden, evoking the chaos and misery previously seen during the bombing of Hamburg as part of Operation Gomorrah in 1943. The bombing of Dresden remains one of the most controversial war crimes committed by the Allied forces during World War II. The Germans thought that as long as the Luftwaffe did not bomb the city of Oxford, Dresden would remain safe from Allied bombings, as the city itself was of no military significance. However, they were wrong, and on February 13th and 14th of 1945, the centuries-old medieval city known as the beautiful Florence of the Elbe was ravaged. Dresden, known for its unique architecture and cultural heritage, was targeted by over 4,000 tons of incendiary and explosive bombs dropped by Allied aircraft. The result was a raging firestorm that cremated more than 30,000 citizens and turned hundreds of buildings into dust. Over 1,200 heavy bombers participated in the destruction of Dresden. Allied raids was scheduled every 3 hours to interrupt emergency services, like fire trucks and ambulances. Only 10% of the city was left intact, and the rest became a pile of rubble or was severely damaged. The medieval Lutheran Church of Our Lady of Dresden Frauenkirche was completely destroyed, and its ruins were left as a memorial for 50 years. The church was not rebuilt until 1994, after the reunification of Germany. Today, German efforts to replace the Church of Our Lady have been successful thanks to the hundreds of original fragments salvaged by the common folk. In the 1990s, Organizations such as the Dresden Historical Neumarkt Society were founded to rebuild the Baroque buildings that once stood in the avenues of the city's historic center. Meanwhile, other heavily damaged Dresden landmarks, such as the Semperoper or Saxony State Opera House and the Zwinger Palace, were slowly rebuilt as Germany reached economic stabilization in the early 2000s. Bombing of Hamburg. As the notion of total war expanded, the Royal Air Force Bomber Command began to gradually increase pressure on the German armed forces by deliberately bombing civilian targets. The objective was to diminish the enemy's morale and force the Luftwaffe to adopt a defensive position. As part of the sustained strategic bombing campaigns of the Allied powers during 1943, the Allied command decided to launch Operation Gomorrah with the bombing of Hamburg. The operation was named after the ancient biblical city destroyed by God in the Old Testament for the many sins of the population. Hamburg was the perfect target for the Royal Air Force and the operation's purposes because it was Germany's second-largest city and would demonstrate that Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe was incapable of defending the motherland skies. Beginning on July 24, 1943, the Royal Air Force launched a series of air raids that lasted for 8 days and severely damaged the city of Hamburg. The British would eventually call it the Hiroshima of Germany once the war ended. Over 40,000 civilians perished, and more than 190,000 were wounded, while more than 1 million Germans were left homeless. The bombing's concentration and the dry weather resulted in a hellish firestorm, with winds of up to 240 kilometers per hour and temperatures that exceeded 800 degrees. In addition, more than 20 square kilometers were burned, and leaked oil from damaged ships in the harbor ignited and spread through the canals of Hamburg. Most port workers lived in the Rottenburg Zort and Hammerbrook quarters near the port, and they were completely destroyed. The Eilbeck residential district was also severely damaged, and only the basic structure of the buildings was left standing. 75% of all buildings were destroyed with the bombings, and the 4 leading shipyards that supplied the city were rendered useless for the rest of the war. The Allies would continue pummeling Hamburg until it surrendered days after Hitler's suicide. Like Dresden and other German locations, the population has taken action to restore the damaged buildings over the decades. Bombing of Cologne. The city of Cologne was another of the many German cities that suffered considerable damage during World War II. As far back as the outbreak of the war, Cologne was bombed in 260 different air raids conducted by the US and Royal Air Forces. The first bombing occurred on May 12, 1940. However, the bombing raid that did the most damage to the city occurred during the 30th and 31st of May in 1942. Over 1,000 British aircraft participated in the destruction of the city when Marshal of the Royal Air Force Arthur Harris decided to use every British aircraft available. Most of the bomber force was composed of medium bombers, such as the Vickers Wellington. For Operation Millennium, and specifically the bombing of Cologne, 1,047 aircraft were mobilized. The Royal Air Force bombers flew in a narrow, dense formation to overwhelm German Night Raider defenses, and the bombers passed over Cologne in just 90 minutes. Of the 1,000 bombers, 868 dropped their ordnance over the city. More than 35,000 tons of explosive and incendiary weapons were dropped until the war's end. Overall, 3,300 commercial buildings were destroyed, 2,100 were heavily damaged by fire, and over 25,000 buildings received light to medium impacts. Churches, schools, hospitals, cinemas, apartments, and historical buildings were lost to the flames originating from the explosive bomb loads. Damage extended to the city districts of Riel, Nippes, and Altstadt Nord. Square Ebertplatz and Reichensberger Platz, where the regional court was located, was also damaged. Historical and religious buildings, like the Church of St. Agnes and the iconic Cathedral of Cologne, where a famous standoff took place during the last days of the war, remained in relatively good condition despite the pummeling. Many people still credit this to a miracle. Hohenzollern Bridge, Mühlheimer Brücke, and the Hindenburg Bridge were also destroyed, and the railway station was rendered obsolete alongside Dischhaus. Urban planner Rudolf Schwarz was responsible for the reconstruction of the city. Several lost monuments, like the 12 Romanesque Catholic churches, took decades to rebuild and were not finished until the late 1990s. The city slowly regained its beautiful green areas and its cultural background. Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels to find more exciting historical content. And don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notified of our newest videos.